Dear Mother Munchausen, us brothers 1 through 3, we all belong to thee. Our mother, strong and proud, can no one see the shroud? You hurt your son, the first, false tears behind the hearse. We too belong to you, our screams aren't heard as true. You beat, you bruise, you lie, while no one bats an eye. Poor Billy's fate would come, his death would leave me numb. Just I belong to you, frightened through and through, and now I must be gone before you take me too. That is an original poem by me. Kinda sucked, but I tried. How is everyone this morning? How are we all doing? If you have graced the internet with your presence at all recently, you'll be quite aware of the Gypsy Rose case and her recent release from prison. If you aren't caught up on her story, honestly, good for you. But here is a 10-second recap. Quote, Gypsy Rose Blanchard orchestrated her mother's death along with her then boyfriend in 2015 after suffering years of abuse in an apparent Munchausen syndrome by proxy case. After serving 8.5 years, she was released in December 2023. End quote. Honestly, I'm not sure why I hadn't thought of this earlier as a jumping point, but today we are diving into the disturbing world of Munchausen by proxy. Today I bring you the story of Priscilla Phillips and the first ever court case to rule on Munchausen. My name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources for today come from CBS News, ABC News, Investigation and Crime UK, and the rest I will put down below. Just to clear the air and make sure we are all on the same page here, let's take a minute to briefly talk about what Munchausen by proxy exactly is, with the help of some much smarter people. According to ABC News, Munchausen by proxy is a form of mental illness that falls under the umbrella of what are known as factitious disorders, a group of mental disturbances that includes patients who act physically or mentally ill to seek attention and empathy without obvious benefits like financial gain. Quote, as its name suggests, in Munchausen by proxy, the symptoms of a disease are fabricated by someone close to the patient, most commonly a parent, leading to unnecessary and often painful intervention and treatment. Interestingly, 30 to 70% of those who falsify illness in children also falsify illness in themselves. The term Munchausen syndrome by proxy was first coined in 1977 by an English pediatrician, Roy Meadow. Quote, Munchausen by proxy derives from the Munchausen syndrome, in which the medical fabrication is self-directed and is named after a German cavalry officer known for exaggeration of his war battles. The most common scenario of Munchausen by proxy involves a parent who causes symptoms in the child and repeatedly takes the child to medical professionals with the goal of having procedures performed on their child. Many perpetrators show features of borderline personality disorder and often have histories of difficult childhood relationships with their parents, or even their own history of abuse and or neglect. Munchausen by proxy is incredibly rare, so rare, in fact, that reliable numbers on its incidence in the US are difficult to come by. Research in other countries such as Australia and the United Kingdom suggests that only a tiny percentage of children diagnosed with a serious illness are cases of Munchausen by proxy. A child of a parent suffering from the disorder may have had a long history of unexplained illness. These parents are typically very willing to have their children experience the discomfort and risk associated with medical procedures, including surgery. Although these parents may demonstrate a wide base of knowledge about medical conditions, they are also simultaneously vague about the details of their own children's illness. These parents may be prone to exaggeration or lying about other aspects of their lives, and may even get hostile if challenged." End quote. The article would go on to mention how difficult this disease is to track across time, how medications are fruitless, and how therapy even holds many of its own challenges. But that is a brief, hopefully helpful, informative overview of what we're talking about today. Okie dokie. Like I mentioned above, we are covering the first criminal court case to ever consider Munchausen by proxy, the case of Priscilla Phillips. Almost all of the information regarding this case comes from NikkiMeredith.com. It was tough to research this one. There was barely a wiki page about it. Anywho, in the early 1970s, husband and wife Steve and Priscilla Phillips adopted a 6-month-old baby girl from a Korean orphanage since Priscilla had had her tubes tied after the birth of their second son about 2 years prior. This perfect Californian family welcomed the new family member with open arms and renamed her Tia, as she was born Hung Ha Ching. Priscilla's excitement could not be contained, with colorful decorations splattered against the baby room's walls and the crib filled to the brim with stuffed animals. This was her dream. Having grown up in a female-dominant household, living with 3 other males was okay, but Priscilla yearned for another female presence, and she finally had it. Her picture-perfect family was only soon spoiled when Tia began to get sick. At first, it was diaper rashes, ear infections, and random bouts of diarrhea. Quote, and then the episodes of diarrhea got serious. At times, she would lose half of her body weight in a series of, quote, explosions, and she would have to be rushed to the nearby Kaiser Hospital to have fluids poured into her. Intermittently, she would be all right, and Priscilla would take her shopping or down to the community pool with other kids. On Sundays, she would dress in her frilly outfits and bring her to church. Then abruptly, Tia would get violently ill again. Numerous tests and surgical procedures were performed by doctors searching for an explanation and desperately trying to control her symptoms. There were x-rays, scans, blood tests, and diet changes. Tubes were inserted into her nose and into her veins. She was transferred to other hospitals where even more tests were done. Sometimes, lab tests would show very high levels of sodium throughout her system. Doctors worked on a theory that a tumor was causing the excessive sodium secretion, but nothing showed up on any of the x-rays. Finally, they decided to perform a surgical procedure that involved opening up the area from the sternum to the pubic bone in order to examine all of the body's organs. They were reluctant to subject Tia's weak little body to the survey, but felt her condition was serious enough to warrant the risk. Tests would show no tumor, no abnormality, end quote. Through all of this, Priscilla stood right there with Tia, feeding her, dressing her, and even helping out the nurses as much as she could. The staff remembered being impressed by how attentive and involved she was with her daughter, some of them even considering her a friend. Priscilla even started writing a diary with updates as to Tia's condition or notes from the doctors. For example, Wednesday began small amounts of Pedialyte, Nutranogen, weighed approximately 75 kilos, extremely dehydrated. Thursday, IV continued until 5:30 p.m. Some diarrhea appeared to be improving, more alert. Friday, diarrhea and vomiting again, screaming, cramping, fever 102. It seemed like there was no end in sight for poor Tia. Only 3 months before Tia's second birthday in February of 1977, quote, Priscilla found her in her crib covered with vomit and diarrhea. The baby was in shock, she was convulsing, and she was blue. I feel like that should have said 7.5 kilos, not 75, and I'm just realizing that now. Sorry. Priscilla rushed her to the hospital, but by the next day, it was clear that her brain was dead. Reverend Jim Hutchinson, the Phillips minister, was there when Tia was pulled from the respirator. Quote, Priscilla asked to hold her. She took that little body in her arms and sobbed. Steve stood by and cried his heart out. End quote. The Phillips agreed to an autopsy, but again, nothing was found. The report simply said that Tia died of, quote, chronic massive secretory diarrhea, end quote. Right after Tia's death, the Phillips decided to adopt another little girl. This time, quote, Priscilla said, we specifically requested a healthy child. First of all, don't you think you ought to wait a bit and maybe mourn this loss first? Didn't that seem like a red flag to anybody? Like, let's say if I were to go get a maple nut ice cream cone and accidentally drop it on the sidewalk, I could go back to the shop and order another one. You can't do that with kids. And who has the audacity to request a healthy child? Like, of course you want all children to be healthy. Oh, a cancer baby. We'll wait. Thanks. Anywho, Priscilla got her wish, and on November 3rd, my birthday, 1997, less than a year later, Seol Young Kim arrived from Korea, where they quickly changed her name to Mindy. Mindy. Such a beautiful name. No offense to anyone named Mindy, but to go from Seol Hung Kim to Mindy is kind of sad. Okay, only months later, on February 3rd, exactly 1 year after Tia died, Mindy was hospitalized with many of the same symptoms Tia had showed. The doctors wouldn't believe it. This was too large a coincidence. Not again. Even Priscilla's friends and favorite nurses refused to believe this was simply happening again. Quote, on February 25th, after noticing that Mindy was excreting exorbitant amounts of sodium, Dr. Estelle Carfe, a Kaiser pediatrician, discovered that a bottle of Mindy's in the hospital refrigerator contained 20 times more sodium than it should have. After testing to make sure that the batch of commercially prepared formula was not defective, she ordered Mindy placed in the ICU, restricted the Phillips visiting privileges, and reported the case to Marin County Protective Services. Priscilla said she didn't mix that bottle of formula. However, a couple of nurses said they heard her say that she did. End quote. And so, an investigation was launched by the San Rafael Police Department. Further tests proved the substance in Mindy's formula was sodium bicarbonate. Their house, along with every belonging, was searched, but nothing turned up besides a carton of baking soda and a carton or tin of baking powder. Meanwhile, Mindy had improved greatly and was placed in a foster home. Fancy that. But that bitch, Priscilla, wouldn't have it, and soon she petitioned the court to regain custody. The following year, on April 26, 1978, Priscilla woke up to a beautiful sunny day and smiled as she headed into work at a welfare office. Her smile quickly faded as she pulled into the lot where a handful of police officers waited for her. Quote, Detective Ted Lindquist avoided the preliminaries. We are here to arrest you for the murder of Tia Phillips. Flanked by two other officers from the San Rafael Police Department, he handcuffed her, walked her past astonished co-workers, and whisked her away in a squad car. Priscilla recalls, I couldn't believe it was happening. I felt like I was in the middle of a dream, a nightmare. It's so frightening to think that you can lead a normal life and end up living your worst fear, end quote. Priscilla's nightmares really began when two medical experts, San Francisco coroner Boyd Stevens and UC San Francisco pediatrician and, quote, body fluid physiologist, Dr. Malcolm Holliday, examined Tia's records and concluded that she had been receiving an exorbitant amount of sodium substance from an outside source. Dr. Holliday said that the pattern of sodium levels in her blood, stools, and urine were such as to rule out any congenital disease. If he had seen her records at the time of her illness, he said, he would have recognized it. But no one at Kaiser had his expertise, nor were the Kaiser doctors looking for a, quote, external source of sodium. The police decided that Priscilla was the only, quote, common denominator. There were too many hospitals for a Kaiser employee to have been responsible, and some of the episodes occurred at home. Steve Phillips was ruled out because he had not been with Tia prior to some of the attacks. Still, bringing this theory to trial with only circumstantial evidence would prove quite difficult. And first, they had to find a motive amidst this entire mess. According to Nikki Meredith, Deputy District Attorney Josh Thomas employed the services of Dr. Martin Blinder, the psychiatrist whose reputation for exotic court testimony was firmly established, where he provided the notorious, quote, Twinkie defense in the Dan White murder trial, which was a whole conundrum in and of itself. Dr. Blinder familiarized himself with the literature on Munchausen syndrome by proxy and would explain in court that parents afflicted with this syndrome make their children ill in order to be the center of a medical drama and to be viewed with sympathy and admiration by others. Quote, on the surface, he told the court, they are loving and caring parents. Their outward appearance makes them the last to be suspected, end quote. Binder could offer no opinion on Priscilla directly because her attorney, Edwin Caldwell, would not permit him to interview her. Meanwhile, a small army of other psychiatric experts dissected Priscilla's psyche. Kentfield psychiatrist Bernard Bradman evaluated her when she was trying to get Mindy back. At the request of defense attorneys, Oakland psychologist Paul Berg interviewed her and gave her a battery of tests. And then later, a staff psychiatrist for the Department of Corrections also evaluated her. Everybody wanted a part. None of these doctors found a mental disorder, or, as Dr. Satin would say, quote, all of her psychiatric and psychological examinations are consistent with essential mental health, end quote. On May 26, 1979, after a 2.5-month trial with testimony from 49 witnesses filling more than 4,000 pages of transcript, the jury of 4 men and 8 women found Priscilla guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Tia and guilty of endangering the life of Mindy. Priscilla's screams could be heard 3 courtrooms away. One of the jurors, fireman Jerome Pelosi, says Priscilla's screams, quote, hurt deep down. I don't believe she meant to kill that baby, end quote. He says the jury was convinced by the medical evidence, in spite of the fact that it was all circumstantial. And so, on June 29th of 1979, Priscilla Phillips was sent off to the California Institute for Women, where she served only 5 months of a 6-year sentence before her release. The community and people close to Priscilla have been torn over whether or not she would have or even could have committed this crime. And this is honestly the real tea right here. This comes, of course, from Nikki's article as well. The people in Terra Linda, California, who knew Priscilla are divided over the question of her innocence, but her loyal supporters are the most vocal. Quote, anger and disbelief. That's the best way to describe how I feel, says Jan Dudier, a registered nurse and one of Priscilla's closest friends. Referring to the damning medical testimony, she says, quote, from my work in medicine, I know that the medical facts are not black and white, but rather shades of gray, end quote. Marilyn Hansen, a social worker who shared a desk with Priscilla for 3 years, is also convinced of her innocence. I keep flashing back to a weekend when Priscilla and Steve got permission to take Tia out of the hospital, and our 2 families drove down to Mendocino. She recalls, Tia loved to play in the sand, and Priscilla watched her with such delight. There was so much love there, end quote. Dr. Satin also believes that neither the murder nor the motive are consistent with Priscilla's personality. He says that, unlike Priscilla, other mothers with Munchausen syndrome by proxy tend to be mentally disturbed women with low self-esteem and weak attachments to their husbands and families. Quote, Priscilla is not a lonely, isolated woman who needs to create situations in order to have contact with people, end quote. Another vote for Priscilla's innocence comes from Mindy's new parents, Pat and Harry Wrigley. They said Mindy, who they call Sarah now, poor girl, but it is better than Mindy, had bouts of diarrhea for months after she first came to live with them in Vallejo, far from the reach of Priscilla's alleged sodium bicarbonate. But there are those on the other side as well. Cindy Tibbetts, a woman who managed an apartment building where Priscilla once lived, says she always felt Priscilla had a peculiar reaction to illness. Quote, she seemed to enjoy getting sick. She was always coming down with something, some kind of virus, an asthma attack, or a kidney infection. She also says Priscilla made a big deal over the boys' medical problems, no matter how small. Quote, I even heard her exaggerate her children's symptoms over the phone to doctors, end quote. Reverend Hutchinson, the minister at Aldersgate Methodist, has known Priscilla for about 9 years. He believes the evidence against her, quote, stands on its own merit. But he also says that he would have given anything for proof of her innocence. In looking back on Priscilla's relationship with her children, Reverend Hutchinson believes Priscilla had an excessive need to have her children depend on her. He says she needed to maintain the intensity of that bond, especially with Tia. He also believes that supporting Priscilla after her conviction would be, quote, reinforcing an act of denial. Steve and Priscilla have since withdrawn from that church and joined another. What do you think? Honestly, I'm torn too. There's a lot of battling claims, opinions, and even some data. I was fully on side. She did it until Mindy's new parents, or Sarah's new parents, said that, I mean, obviously the symptoms could continue for a while, but months? I don't know. So I leave you with that information to decide for yourself. As for Phillips and Priscilla, she told reporters, quote, it's very hard for me to be around little girls who are the age Tia would be if she had lived. Life must go on. I still have my boys. One day at a time, end quote. Since her conviction, they had to sell their house to pay legal fees, and she's no longer allowed to work as a social worker due to the whole convicted of killing her daughter. But on the other hand, her 10-year-old boy Eric said after she had only been home for a few months that life was almost back to normal. And that, my friends, is the sad and puzzling case of Priscilla Phillips. A bit of a weird one today. It was, however, about time I hopped on the Munchausen bandwagon. Per usual, I will be reading another story for y'all after the music, so stick around if you'd like. Thank you all once again for tuning in and taking the time out of your day. Always, always appreciated. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Hi again. I am actually going to share 2 articles with you today. They tie together, and I think it's important to connect them. Also, trigger warning, there is a whole lot of sexual assault mentioned. This is the story of Michelle Fourniret, aka the Ogre of the Ardens, from Crime and Investigation UK and CBS News. Quote, Michelle liked to go for drives with his wife by his side and with their baby son safely in the back of their van. What differentiated this family from any other was that their road trips ended in rape, mutilation, and murder of virgins. The media called Fourniret the Ogre of the Ardens. Though his crimes were massive, the man police arrested was small, gray-haired, and bespectacled. Michel Fourniret was born in 1942 in Sedan, France, near the Belgian border. His father was a metalworker and his mother was a farmer's daughter. Michelle was a quiet child with a slightly above average IQ who enjoyed chess and classical music. but as an adult, he struggled to hold down a job. Forestry worker and school supervisor were some of the many jobs he tried and failed at. But it was his string of convictions that revealed his true vocation. His first arrest in 1966 was for child molestation. It ended his first marriage, and he had fathered his 3 children with his second wife, but this marriage also ended after he was again arrested for the rape and indecent assault of minors. It was while he was in custody awaiting his trial that he placed an advert in a Catholic magazine asking for a pen pal. Monique Olivier, a nurse and mother of 3, replied. As a child, she had suffered from a stammer, and as an adult, she had suffered from a series of physically abusive relationships. Olivier promised to help Michelle, quote, hunt virgins if he helped her kill her former husband. Only one part of that bargain would be fulfilled. Michelle was let out early because he had been a model prisoner, and only 2 months later, the killing spree started. The killer couple claimed their first victim in December 1987. They approached 17-year-old Isabelle Laville in a van as she was on her way home from school. They said they were lost and persuaded her to climb into the van to help them with directions. Michelle then raped and killed her. 1 year later, 20-year-old Fabian Leroy was abducted from a supermarket. Her body was found the next day. She had been shotgunned through the chest. In 1989, the couple claimed their youngest victim, Elizabeth Brichet. She was just 12 years old when she was abducted from the Belgian town of Namur. Her body was found 14 years later in the grounds of the couple's chateau. Michel would either strangle, shoot, or sometimes inject air into his victim's veins to cause a heart attack. Death, however, was no escape from his attentions. After he stabbed to death one girl with a screwdriver, he sexually assaulted her then dead body. Olivier would watch as he raped and murdered his victims, and they would later recreate these scenes in their sex life. Michel would either dispose of the bodies in his grounds or the surrounding area, and the killings went on for years, but the authorities treated each case separately. There was little sharing of information between the French and Belgian police, and no one considered the possibility that the Ardennes region had an unusually high murder rate because a serial killer was using it as his hunting ground. With no investigative task force after them, the couple may have never been arrested if it weren't for the escape of one of their victims. In 2003, Michel tried to abduct a 13-year-old girl. He boasted to her that Marc Dutroux, the then recently apprehended Belgian pedophile and serial killer, was no match for him. But she managed to escape by biting her way through the ropes binding her wrists and jumping out of the van at some traffic lights. Before she fled, she noted his registration. Smart girl. The police questioned both Michel and Monique, but they didn't realize that they were interviewing the French equivalent of Fred and Rose West. It was only Olivier's mistaken belief that the police knew more than they did that caused her to confess in the hope that her sentence would be reduced. The first murder she confessed to resembled that of a Leeds University student, Joanna Parrish, who disappeared in Burgundy in 1990. Confronted with her confession, Michel would confess to many murders, but not that one. End quote. And there ends Article 1. Essentially, after confessing, he served 18 years or so and would end up dying in 2021. Also, side note, I've never heard of Marc Dutroux, and I have to write that down because maybe that could be a good case to do. Anywho, the second article came out just over a month ago in December because his ex-wife, Monique Olivier, is on trial again for her involvement. Quote, the widow of a French serial killer known as the Ogre of the Ardennes. Also, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If I haven't been, I'm sorry. On Tuesday, she admitted she was, quote, bait in the 1990 rape and murder of British student Joanna Parrish by her former husband. Confronted with images of Parrish's swollen face after her body was pulled from the River Yonne, Monique Olivier said, quote, "It's because of me she's gone. It's unforgivable," end quote. She remained silent in the glass-screened dock for long moments as she looked at the pictures before pushing them away with a trembling hand. Olivier is on trial for her role in 3 kidnappings and murders by her late husband, Michel Fourniret, and her role in rapes and attempted rape in 2 of the cases. On, quote, hunts with her husband, Olivier said during cross-examination, "I was the dog. I was never anything but the dog that must obey its master." Last week, Monique took the stand and admitted to all of the facts in the cases. Now 75 years old and serving a life sentence issued in 2008, her case deals with the abduction, rape, and murder of 20-year-old Joanna Parrish in 1990 and 18-year-old Marie Angeli in 1988. Monique is also charged with the disappearance of 9-year-old Estelle Mouzin in 2003, whose body has never been found despite 2 decades of intensive searches. Marie's remains also have never been found, while Parrish's naked body was recovered from the Yonne River in the French department of the same name. She recounted how she remained in the front seat of the couple's car when Michel climbed into the back to kill and rape Parrish in May 1990. Quote, "Like a coward, I do nothing. I hear her scream a little, but I don't intervene. It's fear, panic. I am unable to do anything at all," she said. The Parrish family had left the courtroom on Tuesday when Joanna's murder was discussed, staying away from Monique Olivier's questioning. "I can't manage to remember all of the details. I mix them up with other killings," Olivier told Judge Didier Safar. I love these names, but there's so many of them. Michel, who sought out virgins to rape and murder over nearly 2 decades, is believed to have answered a classified ad Parrish bought in a local paper offering English lessons, hoping to earn some extra money to visit her boyfriend in Czechoslovakia. Parrish's family, then boyfriend, and their lawyer had on Monday pressed the idea that the young woman would never have gotten into a car alone with a strange man to highlight Olivier's vital role. Michel himself, who died in 2021 before any trial for these 3 killings, said of Marie and Parrish in 2018, "I'm the only one responsible for their fates. If those people had not crossed my path, they would still be alive." According to BBC, Olivier is already serving life in prison for her part in the past crimes of her former husband, and now she has been handed down a second life sentence with a minimum of 20 years. So basically, even if she ever does get paroled, she would be like 95. And that is the tragic story of the Ardennes ogre. Sorry to end on such an awful note, but I do hope you enjoyed it. I think it was kind of fun. A little bit longer today. Yeah. And with that, I bid you adieu. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you.